Well, thank you so much for all of you for being here, and thank you to Nikole for being here for this conversation. We are so excited to be able to talk with you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I can't even begin to tell you how much this moment means. So thank you. Thank you to our audience as well for being here and being part of this conversation with us today. There's so many things that we could talk to you about today, but we're gonna, I think, focus on two little things: democracy and journalism. Just little things. In 2022, you founded the Center for Journalism and Democracy at Howard University with the goal to push for pro-democracy journalism, a term that you've said is defined by acknowledging journalism is inherently a form of activism. I think, though, a lot of us wouldn't really think journalism, activism really fits into the same sentence. So I'm curious then, can you explain a little bit more as to what pro-democracy journalism is and how we're currently missing the mark on that as an industry?
Sure. So these seats are very awkward, which is why y'all are sitting up like that. I can't quite figure out how to sit in this thing. Hello, everyone. I always love coming back to Chicago. Really excited for the conversation, and I love journalism awards. Of course, we don't do this for journalism, but in really dark times, it's just inspiring to see all of the important work that's being done every day and to be able to sit with your fellow practitioners and acknowledge that good work. So speaking of, before I answer your question, I really just have to say it was so amazing to see the Invisible Institute win those 2 Pulitzer Prizes this week. I don't know, Jamie, is Jamie in here? Hey, Jamie. Jamie is just, such a beacon of always centering us in why we should be doing this work. And I don't know if any of the journalists who won that Pulitzer are in here. Are any of y'all in here? Just amazing. And I hope you all are just basking. Again, it's not why you do the work, but when you can actually do work that is true to your mission and why you got into this and take home that biggest prize, is just so affirming, and hopefully will bring even more eyes to your work, funding, resources, and support, and all of those great things. So I'm just honored to be in the space with you all tonight. Okay, so now back to your question. It was interesting that I was introduced right after there was a discussion of Ida B. Wells, because I've always seen in Ida B. Wells my model of what journalism should be. So when I say journalism is activism, I don't mean that it's the same type of activism that goes out in the street and protests, right? It's not that type of activism, but we are hopefully uncovering the things that people would protest about, right? We are helping people, as Ida B. Wells said, the people must know before they can act, and there's no educator like the press, that we are helping people to understand the way that power is being wielded against them and empowering people to take action. When I think most journalists don't get into journalism because we want to be stenographers, or we just think it's interesting to write about things. When a journalist reports about, CPS, not Chicago Public Schools, I was talking about Children Protective Services, but it could be CPS, whatever it is. But when we report about institutions that aren't working, we're not doing that just because it's interesting. We want those institutions to function well. We want vulnerable people to be protected and to be served. So of course that's a form of activism. I said this at a journalism conference a few weeks ago. The motto of the Washington Post is "Democracy dies in darkness." That's not a neutral position. That's saying our role as journalists is to protect democracy. So I think that we have been led to believe that we have to be neutral even in the face of unprecedented attacks on our democratic freedoms, on whether we will have democracy or not. And I frankly think that's an abdication of the role of journalism. We do have a severe imbalance in our parties right now. We have one party that is deeply flawed but actually believes in democracy, and one party that doesn't. And so we can't pretend that that's not true because we want to appear as if our coverage is balanced. So what I'm really trying to do is tell journalists, like, liberate yourselves to take a position on democracy. If we as journalists can't take a position on democracy, we can't exist, right? A free press cannot exist if we don't have democracy. So we need each other, and our founders, as deeply flawed as they were, understood we needed to have the very first amendment, the first protection, had to be a free press, that a democracy requires a free press, and we are the only profession protected in the Constitution for a reason. So I'm really trying to call us into our mandate, and I actually think it's cowardice to pretend otherwise. It's cowardice to pretend that we have no stake in this. We absolutely do, and if we're not doing that, we should choose a different field, is what I think. So, there we go.
But how do you think, in a practical sense, acknowledging that and accepting that we have this view towards democracy should play out in the work? What do you expect to see in the work that's different from people who are doing a pro-democracy journalism as opposed to more traditional means?
I really think that, pro-democracy journalists are not pretending that there is this balance in the coverage, right? So what it looks like is not wanting to call what Trump is doing what he's doing. Or if we write a story that appears to be negative about Trump, then we have to write a story that appears to be negative about Biden, because that's what balance looks like. But these two things, again, are not the same. I think not wanting for 10 years almost now, really grappling with how do you cover someone who eschews all constitutional norms? How do you cover someone who's constantly lying, but you don't want to call that person a liar because then that will appear partisan? So by always trying to appear balanced, we're actually obscuring the truth. We're not allowing the people who we are supposed to be educating to understand the dangers, the perils, because it just seems like, well, he's just, a bad candidate, like candidates are bad often. He's just corrupt like candidates are corrupt often. That's just not the case. And I think we really struggle with that as a profession, because too often we take pro-democracy journalism as being partisan. It's not partisan. Being for democracy is not partisan. It just appears that way because we have one political party that is anti-democratic right now, anti-democratic little d. But that's not our job. And so what often we're thinking is us appearing to be independent is actually kind of taking a side. It's taking a side where we're more afraid of critique from the right than critique of the left. We don't consider critique from the left to be legitimate, but critique from the right scares us. And so we overcorrect to the point of not being truthful, not being honest, not allowing people to judge. And what we'll say is, well, our job is to just report what happens, and Americans can figure it out. But if you're not reporting what happens in a way that's actually reflective of what's happening, then we can't figure it out. So that, to me, is what we have to do. It's not taking a stand in favor of a particular candidate or a particular party, but it is taking a stand in favor of actual truth, in favor of actual democracy, and saying that, yes, we do take a position that we need a democracy, and candidates that are anti-democracy will be covered in that way.
I think that makes me also think about a buzzing topic in journalism, which is everyone's favorite topic. One of them, objectivity. And especially with the 1619 Project, we saw that you incorporated your family's story and history into the reporting. You included your father and how he had the American flag in the front lawn, and even interviewed your family members in the Hulu series. I'm curious then, when it comes to incorporating those personal stories into your reporting, do you think that there is a way to be objective when you're telling a truth, but also being a part of that truth? And what does that look like to you?
Okay, so I'm gonna kind of separate those two things, because the 1619 Project had an explicit stated point of view. It didn't pretend to be objective, and I won the Pulitzer for commentary, right? So that is a different type of journalism. That's a journalism where we're all aware that this is coming from a perspective that we say we're telling the lens, we're telling the story of America through the lens of slavery, and explicitly centering slavery, centering Black contributions, and yes, combining kind of personal memoir with reporting, which I've been doing for quite a while now, right? My This American Life piece kind of begins with me talking about my own school desegregation experience. One of the pieces I was most known for prior to the 1619 Project was about me choosing a school for my daughter in a segregated city. And she was in kindergarten then, and now she's about to go to high school. Still in neighborhood segregated, high poverty public schools, by the way. And so I've often kind of mined personal narrative, but also in deeply reported pieces where the facts are not in dispute. So that's what the 1619 Project was, but I think your bigger question is about this thing that I and many others, including Wes Lowry, who was formerly of the Washington Post, have pushed back upon, which is that any of us are objective, or that any report is objective, when clearly it's not. If you are a human being, you have opinions about everything that you cover, except things you don't know enough about. And as soon as you know enough about something, you have formed an opinion about that thing. And so what we are really mostly doing is pretending or trying to reflect this notion of objectivity when we actually are not objective. And I think the way that mainstream media has used that is to really deflect from criticism, right? Well, I know you're saying this was unfair, but I'm just being objective here. Well, what about our profession is objective? What beats we cover, right? Every newsroom has the cops beat, but not a poverty beat. That's a choice. You could cover poverty the same way you cover any other institution or problem, but we don't do that. Who gets on the front page, what story gets on the front page, who we lead with, how we frame stories, all of these are subjective decisions. But we say they're objective, and then we don't have to listen to criticism and reflect. Because we are, we're here at Journalism Awards because we are the profession who loves to award ourselves more than any other profession on earth. I mean, when I was listening to the bio, I was like, we gotta cut that shit down. You don't gotta list every damn award I've ever won, right? Like, we don't have to do that, but we do, because we think that tells us something about how great we are as a profession. And so when we focus on those types of things and this belief in this award system, then we are using this objectivity to really not take time to self-reflect. To not allow people to say, I don't actually think you got that wrong. I think you were biased. No, we're just being objective. But we're not. Who we center in our stories, I say this all the time. On any given day, I mean, look at your local newspaper, right? Look at the demographics of the city. Look at the demographics of where I live, New York City. Look at the demographics of Detroit. And then look at your daily report and ask, who does it reflect? Does it reflect the people who live in the city, or does it reflect power? 9 times out of 10, it's reflecting power. So I don't believe in objectivity. I don't believe it's possible. I don't pretend. When you're a black woman, people presume that they can see your bias literally on your skin. But I see white people's bias literally on their skin as well. They just don't see it often. And so, to me, understanding that we are all reporting from a lens, from our class lens, our racial lens, our gender lens, all of these different things that have shaped the way that we see stories, the way we see what's important, who we value, what we cover. And I think it's important to recognize that, because how else can you report against your biases if you don't recognize that you have them? So what I advocate for, what others advocate for, is objectivity of method, which is me saying, I know that I think school segregation is wrong. I know that I'm writing because I want people not to segregate our poor black children in schools without resources. So if I know that, then I know I have to report in a way where I'm also reporting against my bias when I'm interviewing people. Am I being fair to them? Are my facts correct? Have I framed this in a way that's fair? That's the only objectivity I believe in, which is trying to make your methodology as objective as possible, but understanding that we're going to fail in that every single day, because all of us are biased, opinionated people who are reporting through our own lens. I just wish we would be more honest about it. And to be clear, I'm not saying, if you're a political reporter, I should know your political views. I shouldn't know that necessarily, though. If I read your reporting, I kind of know your political reviews, right? Like we think we're camouflaging, and we're not. And I don't want to know who someone voted for, who's covering a political issue. So I'm not saying that. I'm not saying tell everyone and broadcast all your biases, but I'm saying acknowledge that we have them and stop pretending that our field has ever been objective and can be, because it can't and it hasn't.
That's interesting. I'm going to let you go on, but I'm being signaled that I should let you all know that our QR code is still active to please send in questions that way. So,
yeah, I mean, I just also then am curious when it comes to your work at Howard University and how you're teaching then this to students and the future generation of journalists. What's then happening in the classrooms that you're trying to change their approach to maybe how traditional journalism has been taught?
Well, I don't think that I'm advocating to perform journalism in a different way. You know, the skills of journalism are the skills of journalism. You have to verify, you have to get documents, you know, you have to go out and talk to people, you have to be able to read databases, you need to be able to read a budget, like all of those things. Journalism is a trade. Now we've professionalized it, now people are paying $90,000 for a master's degree that I think is totally unnecessary, but that's another. Get a damn internship and somebody will pay you. But you know, I think that the tools of journalism remain the tools of journalism. And I teach my students the tools of journalism. But I also, again, teach them, you know, I'm at Howard, all of my students are Black. Not one of them believes the media has been objective and unbiased. Not one. I don't have to tell them that, because that's actually what motivated them to become journalists in the first place. Just like I was motivated to become a journalist because if we wanted to see Black people in my hometown newspaper, we went to the crime log, because everything else Black people were doing never made it in the newspaper. But I see Black folks doing all kinds of things that don't involve crime, right? So my students know objectivity doesn't exist. What they want to know then, you know, is how can they go in a newsroom and make a difference and tell the stories that aren't being told in the ways that they don't think that they should be told. And the way that I can teach them to do that is I teach them historically informed journalism, right? Study history, understand that the thing you're writing about coming out of this school board meeting has a whole history that built up to that one moment, right? Understand that. Understand the methods of reporting. Understand who are you talking to. If you're only talking to, you know, the CEO, you've missed out on the story, because the person who actually knows the most is the secretary, right? It's the person who keeps the schedule. It's the janitor. It's the people who see who's coming in and out of that building and all of those things that get ignored. So I'm teaching them the skills of journalism. I don't have to teach them about objectivity, but I do try to liberate them because they know that they're getting the messages that somehow they're wrong for acknowledging that they have feelings about these things, or they're wrong for saying, I want to be a journalist because I believe in justice, because I want to fight for social justice. So I try to help them understand the tension between, no, we don't go out in the street and protest, but we have a different form of activism that's just as powerful, and that these things have to work hand in hand, right? Like, have any of y'all ever read The Race Beat? No? Damn, okay, assignment. This is an assignment. Won the Pulitzer Prize. It's one of my favorite books. It's one of the few books I've read twice, because it shows, right, that like the civil rights movement could not have been successful without the press. Because you could be out there doing sit-ins, doing demonstrations, and if they aren't being covered by the press, it's like they don't even happen. And that's what white Southern races depended upon, was that no one was going to see what was happening and no one was going to care. And so the role of the journalists, and at first it was only Black journalists who were covering the protests, was to shine that light, right? To bear witness, to show what was happening. But no one thinks the Black press was being objective on whether they should have rights of citizenship. Of course, they believe they should have rights of citizenship. That's why they became journalists. So that's the tradition that I teach them. But I also teach them, because of this, the level of scrutiny your work is going to face is going to be higher, right? The level of people who aren't going to who want you to slip up. So you have to perfect as much as possible your craft so that your work cannot ever be discredited. And I know a little bit of something about efforts to discredit work.
I mean, I would love to be a fly in the wall in that classroom to hear more about that for sure. I mean, I also you brought up a lot of different points, but one thing that did stick to me was the history element, which you were talking about. Our current moments are built because of the historical moments and the decisions that have been historically made. I was, researching obviously for this interview, and there was a question in which someone had asked you, why you picked the 1619. There's so many moments that you could have picked in American history to change the narrative. And in your response, I'm kind of just thinking about that, changing the narrative, history, maybe not having always the full narrative that has included all voices and perspectives. So when you go to correct a narrative that has been accepted for so long, where do you begin?
1619, no, I'm playing. So one, my first love has always been history. I've been, I'm a nerd. I love history. From a young age, history calmed me because I was seeing the narrative about Black Americans and why we struggled in the ways that we did, that you got from popular media. And then I was seeing the reality of how hard people in my neighborhoods seem to be working and not able to get ahead. And so history helped me understand, our neighborhood was redlined. Okay, that makes sense in why the houses look like that, right? And learning that history helped explain the reality that wasn't making sense based on the narratives that we were receiving. So I didn't become a historian, though, because this is always a bad joke, but sort of true. I wanted people to read what I wrote. Not everyone is a history nerd like myself, but also I wanted to be able to change things. I didn't want to just be looking back, but I wanted to be able to have some impact. But understanding then that you become a journalist because you know that narrative, more than anything else, is what drives policy. More than anything else, right? I mean, go to any sociology department, any department that's like studying data, that's studying, research that works, and you can have all the data, all the things, and that is not what's driving policy. It is, how do people feel? Look at crime, right? Look at crime policy. Look at any policy. Look at why are we not talking about schools at all in this election, right? That's being driven by who determines the narrative of what we should be thinking about and how we should be thinking about that. And I wanted to have a role in doing that. So when I pitched the 1619 project, my work had been, if I'm humble enough to think some of y'all may have read me over the course of years, then my work has just gotten longer and longer and longer. And that's because I kept feeling like I had to go further and further back in history. Like, how can I explain to you why are Chicago public schools segregated like they are? I have to go back to the 1980s. But to explain the 1980s, I have to go back to the 1960s. To explain that, I have to go back to Brown v. Board and the fact that northern districts didn't think Brown applied to them. I have to go back to Ida B. Wells when they literally took integrated schools and segregated them, right? Like, you have to keep going back to understand how we got here. If you want to change narrative, you have to counter that narrative with something else. And what we know too often when it comes to Black folks or other marginalized people is because we don't learn that history, because we don't actually understand that all of the inequality we see has been created through policy, that it's not inevitable, it's not about pathology, it's not about any of those things, it's about decisions that people, institutions, politicians have made. If you don't help people see that, they fill in the blank with what they know. And what they know is that it's something wrong with Black people. And so we have to provide another narrative that builds that history in. And I was really determined to show that you could treat racial inequality as an investigative beat. That you didn't just have to treat racial inequality as like the cataloging of maladies of what are Black people suffering from, as if no one's caused the suffering. That you could show that people are making decisions. And to do that, you have to build in the history. And I just think often how different our coverage of so many things would be if we took some time to study and understand the history that got us here. When you think about no rush, you could have a few more minutes. Thanks, boo. First she held up the 5-minute sign, and then she was like, I'm gonna give y'all a few more minutes.
It's a good conversation,
Appreciate it. But I think about something like, and I give this example often, when Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore by the police. And one, so much of the coverage was after the shit blew up, like when they burned that one gas station, and then all of a sudden, everybody, all the news descends, and then everyone's like, why weren't they protesting peacefully? Except they had been, and we didn't cover it because we didn't think it was important. So again, talk to me about objectivity. We don't make objective news decisions. But so much of the coverage, again, was about that moment, like what led Freddie Gray to get chased down by the police and ultimately killed. But if you studied history, then you know the entire history of segregation in Baltimore, and the fact that Baltimore was under had recently had to settle a long-standing housing discrimination case for violating the Fair Housing Act and intentionally segregating Freddie Gray's neighborhood, and that Freddie Gray had been exposed to lead, right? Like all of these things that help you understand that moment, but instead, people who have no context about what happened there, who have no understanding of the history, are writing about it as if it's just this one moment. And then what do we fill in the blanks with? Well, black folks, we fill in the blanks with understanding what it's like to be over-policed in black neighborhoods. And white folks fill in the blanks with, well, he shouldn't have been committing a crime. With no question of like, how does that moment happen? And that's why I think it's so important to study history. Now, you might not be able to, you know, most people can't write 10,000 words, thank God. I don't even want to read my shit half the time. It's too many words, but I can't help it. And believe me, that's the cut down version. The drafts be coming in at about 16,000 words, okay? Even though I only pitched 4,000 words. So I get that most journalists can't write that much history. But just understanding the history means that you're able to form the story in a more accurate, honest way. It means that maybe you only write 2 paragraphs of historical context, but those 2 paragraphs can be powerful. So it's more for your own edification so that you can be better at writing that story, so that you're not writing in a way that is actually harmful and untrue. So I really wish all journalists would study history and try to just get, even if it's one phone call to a scholar or a community member who has that oral history, to contextualize, because so much of our coverage is absent of that. And again, what that really means is we're not getting to truth or truth.
That's really interesting, and the idea that you have this historical context inform your reporting now, and you're going to give people the information they need, and they're going to make the right decisions out of that, right, is interesting, and we know that the free press then is this crucial aspect of democracy. What I'm curious about is as you alluded to, you've gone through this massive backlash with 1619, right? One of the... Okay, a little bit. Where you did everything that we're talking about here, right? You did the historically informed reporting, you gave people information that they needed to know, and some people didn't want to receive that, and as a result, they blocked other people from seeing it. How do you feel about that? Do you feel betrayed by democracy in that situation?
That's an interesting framing of the question. I don't think it's possible for me to feel betrayed by the United States, because I have very low expectations of my country. But I will say, so I expected backlash to the project. And frankly, when you were trying to reset narrative of American exceptionalism at that, right? These myths, these foundational myths, that we use to justify all types of atrocious inequality and behavior. When you're trying to do that, if you don't have pushback and backlash, you probably would have failed. You know, if I had put the 1619 Project out into the world and there was no backlash, then that meant I told a comforting story that people already knew and that affirmed how they wanted to think about their country. And I was trying to unsettle all of that. So I certainly expected backlash. And initially, it was the backlash that I expected, but I would be lying if I said I could have predicted what that backlash would become, right? I certainly didn't predict that the 1619 Project would set off what has ultimately come the anti-CRT frenzy, that it would be, you know, targeted by federal legislation. that Donald Trump will become obsessed by it without even reading a single word, though I'm convinced he sold a lot of books for me, so I'm not that upset. So no, I couldn't have predicted that, but what I understand is the backlash only demonstrates the power of the work. Because if the work wasn't important, if it wasn't mattering, if it wasn't penetrating outside of just Black people, and Black people are the ones that I care the most about how we would respond to this, but if only Black people embraced it, there wouldn't be a need for this type of backlash. It was the fact that so many Americans of different races were having to think about their country in a new way. You know, again, this is the power of journalism, because everything in the 1619 Project, like, we didn't unearth new history. It's all based on the works of historians going back, some cases 6, 7 decades. But what we were able to do is popularize it for a mass audience and to draw those direct connections from the past to the present. And that was seen as dangerous. And I have to say that's the type of enemies I have made because of the project is my greatest journalistic honor, like, in life. I have fucking amazing enemies. Like, if Trump and Mitch McConnell hate your ass, you are doing something right? Like, so yeah, I guess when I pitched the project, I could not have imagined what it would become. I didn't even know if anybody would read it, frankly. Like, it's tens of thousands of words on slavery and its impact, and this thing we willfully have not wanted to grapple with. It's heavy, it's hard. And 5 years out, I'm still on the road every single week talking about this project. This is like a journalist's dream, that you could produce something that is evoking such strong emotion and so many conversations. So no, I don't feel betrayed, but I am daily disappointed in our country, yes. I think I don't have to tell a group of journalists, I hope, that we are in a very perilous period in our country, where literally, it's not hyperbolic to say we don't know how much democracy we're going to have, and frankly, I think that's true whether Trump gets elected or not. So if there's ever a time for us to be called into our purpose, it is now. And I don't give inspirational speeches, right? Or talks. Like, I want you to be scared as hell. And go out there and do our damn jobs, which are to protect the vulnerable from the way that powerful people want to exploit and harm them, and to save whatever democracy we have and try to make it better. Like, that is our charge. And I don't know, maybe my work has set democracy back, but I hope not.
Well, I do think that with that, we are going to be opening it up to audience questions. Okay. So thank you very much.
We have a few questions from the audience. I'll start with this one as a follow-up to where you were going with the conversation about the upcoming election. What bearing does the outcome of the upcoming presidential election have on the future of journalism and your pro-democracy work specifically?
I love that they didn't trust y'all journalists to ask the questions yourselves. Man, I really don't. I don't try to make predictions. I actually think that this is one of the core problems with journalism right now, is all of these people trying to predict what's going to happen. I think it's one of the reasons why we're losing credibility. So I don't try to do that. I don't know, frankly. I can say, as a student of history, we can draw parallels. I think, based on history, what I'm seeing looks a lot like what we were seeing around the period leading up to the Civil War, that level of political polarization, that level of racial polarization, an entire political party that is on almost, being explicitly in some ways anti-democratic. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I do know that we don't, as a field, seem to have learned enough of the lessons from the last 2 elections. I don't think we have still figured out how to cover creeping autocracy. We don't want to call it that. It feels to us that we'll turn people off, or that will appear partisan if we call the thing what it is. But part of the work I'm doing at the Center for Journalism and Democracy, and I please invite you all to come. We hold an annual summit every year, and it's geared towards educating journalists, to put journalists in the room with political scientists, with historians, with people who have studied eroding democracy abroad and can say, these are the things that we see in other countries when we're losing democracy, and we're seeing all of these things here, to help us to have the understanding, and I also hope the courage and the backbone to go back to our newsrooms and push for more accurate coverage of what's happening. So I can't predict what will happen, but I will say not enough of us are rising to the occasion. And I'm just very fearful that we are carrying weight for the erosion of democracy. We are to be the firewall. That's our role, and the firewall is not holding. So I don't know what the hell is going to happen. I just know I got to get a passport to some other country. Just playing. I'm not leaving.
With that, I think this concludes our panel. I want to thank you all for a transformative and wonderful conversation. And we'll be moving on to our awards. So thank you all so much.